For our next talk, I would like to introduce Rose Bear Don't Walk, who I should say is Dr. Rose Bear Don't Walk. She just completed her PhD, 2 weeks ago? Yeah. She works to bridge science, culture, and health with study of traditional indigenous foods and native plants in Montana. She's a resident of the Flathead Indian Reservation. She is a descendant of the Bitterroot Salish, is that correct? Yes, and Crow tribes. She got a BA in political science from Yale and a master's in environmental studies from University of Montana, and the bio says will receive, but she has received her doctorate from Montana State University this month. As a Luce Indigenous Knowledge Fellow, she centers her work on relationships of Salish people, the relationship the Salish people have with local edible plants and the implications for health and cultural longevity. Her research is First Foods for Health, a community exploration of food plants of the Salish health and our futures. She is going to speak today to us on First Foods for Health, how the traditional plant wisdom of the Bitterroot Salish influence history, well-being, and cultural longevity.
Gest syniac ke pesia usali tam huist en lamke cluis quest, chi scale ustem chi til snjelmen, chines in PLC u chines lemti hul yeswaske u wichin lu pesia yele. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rose Bear Don't Walk, now Dr. Rose Bear Don't Walk. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today to talk about something that is very close to my heart. I represent my Salish community, which is part of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of Montana. We are a Northwest community. And I'm also a descendant of the Crow tribe in Montana, which is on the other opposite side of Montana. But I grew up on the Flathead Indian Reservation pretty much my whole life. I currently live in North Carolina at the moment with my husband. So I was able to do my research in Montana over the past couple of years, but did a majority of my schoolwork remotely, which was a huge blessing for me. Really just grateful to be among other scientists and botanists in the same room. There's not a lot of botanists around me, so this is very cool. I've learned a lot from the previous speakers, and just want to shed some light on the relationships that people have formed with plants over thousands of years. I know a lot of botany tends to focus on the plants themselves, but we also need to understand that people have been cultivating these plants since time immemorial. So I wanted to situate us in time and space. This is a map of Montana. Or what is now Montana, and it shows all of the different traditional territories of the tribes that currently reside there. As you can see, the Pend Oreille and the Salish have that really large area of blue, but we are also known to travel into the Pacific Northwest area as well as Canada. So while it shows that our primary traditional territories, the blue area, we were known to travel very, very far. And this is the same for a lot of the tribes that were also in the Montana region. So if you think about how settler colonization has shaped our relationships with our traditional food plants and the land itself, you can see that from that large area, we became confined to the Flathead Reservation, which is a very small chunk of the overall territory that we were used to and inhabited and traveled for foraging, fishing, hunting, trading, and whatnot. I think it's very important to recognize that borders are very colonial, and a lot of these areas and regions, tribes traversed across for many, many years prior to the reservation area. We also share the Confederacy with the Kootenai people, who are culturally different than the Pend d'Oreille and the Salish, but they put us all together on one reservation when we signed the Hellgate Treaty. They have their own way of using plants, but because we share the same region, a lot of our plants are very similar. And I also wanted to note that the word that we call ourselves is scaly, which is a combination of two words, skelch, which means meat, and stuli, which means land, which basically says that we are meat of the earth and flesh of the land. And that shows the long, long-standing relationship that we have with our local environment and have established a deep, deep knowledge based on our creation stories, but also how long we've been there. This is where I grew up. It's very beautiful. I don't know how many of you have been to Montana. I highly recommend going to check it out. I love it so much. It is not only biodiverse and rich, but we also have lots of culture, as you can see, with the many tribes that reside in the state. That is a picture of blue camas, which is Camassia quamash. It is a very prominent food plant of many tribes, not just in Montana, but in the Pacific Northwest and Canada as well. We were known to trade hundreds and hundreds of pounds across different tribes back in the day. So it's super important to us. Since we are here to celebrate 250 years of American botany, it's really important to understand how historical narrative and Western science has shaped how we view plants, how we name plants, how we have understood plants throughout this kind of short history of botany in America. So these are just two excerpts from the time period that Lewis and Clark came into the Bitterroot Valley and had their first encounter with the Bitterroot Salish. The top one is from the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. I think this has since been updated when I found it, but it just shows that the Lewis and Clark expedition was, meant to explore and understand the local landscape of expanding the West. And it talks about all of the new species and discoveries that they made on their trip. However, given that Indigenous people were on the land for far, 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 far longer before they came across Lewis and Clark, it's really important to note that these species were not new to them. It was only new to these guys that were doing the work and trying to categorize it and write it down. So the bottom excerpt says, in 1805, all was well in Quatish Pukkum. It was early fall. The Salish were busy plucking plump show from low-hanging branches and pounding the cherries until they formed thick cakes to be laid on rocks to dry. They kept for months, once dried. Beside the ever-present preparation for winter, the Salish discovered something new, a group of light-skinned men approaching their home site. This was their first encounter with white males and the beginning of a new history from them. And that was written by the Salish Kalispé Culture Committee, who did a book about the Salish encounters with Lewis and Clark. This is particularly important because I think historical narrative tends to say that colonists or settlers or explorers or scientists happened upon the natives and had these exchanges, when in fact, if you were a native tribe that were in a area for a long period of time, you would know if somebody was coming up to your campsite and, didn't really look like you or dress like you or, have all the same things as you. So the Salish had autonomy in the decision of welcoming Lewis and Clark into their campsite and actually without the Salish and a lot of the generosity of the tribes across their path, they probably wouldn't have survived. We have accounts of when Lewis and Clark came into the Bitterroot Valley that they were pretty starved, they were pretty struggling, and they were having a rough time. And because the Salish were very generous, we welcomed them into our campsite and we fed them. And in particular, we fed them bitterroot, which is a very important staple food for us. So when we think about where credit is due, I think Indigenous peoples gave a lot to the Lewis and Clark expedition and, in fact, to scientific exploration and what we know about plants to this day. So when that encounter happened, the Salish were deep into their seasonal round. And the seasonal round is a very critical component of how many tribes existed and persisted throughout time in their localized environment. This was made by one of my PhD committee members, Tim Ryan. He is a professor of Indigenous science at Salish Kootenai College. Incredible knowledge base. I hope to learn and know as much as him someday. But the seasonal round follows the path of how our ancestors moved across the land throughout the seasons. So it's very much based in the migrations of different animals and birds, but also the different comings and goings of plants. How we moved throughout time was very much shaped by our local landscape, and we had to be very careful observationists of that and what was changing and what was the same. So the seasonal round not only shows all of the different plants that show up in the different times of the seasons, but it also shows when we go hunt bison, when we hunt deer, when we fish, and also the different human activities that happen throughout the year because humans and our landscape can't be separated. They're all part of one cohesive unit that functions together in balance and reciprocity. So some of the human activities we have is trading or celebration within the summer months. We also have our ceremonies in the winter that are really important for us to carry out through the future. The seasonal rounds are highly sophisticated. They are very much based in a deep knowledge of science, deep knowledge of the land, and has been cultivated over thousands of years. This adaptation is a little bit more modern because we have the Gregorian calendar, so we have months now, but we really much pay attention to the seasons and how much they have changed throughout time. So bringing this kind of back to the bitterroot, we call it spectrum, and it has been with us for a very, very long time. It was presented to us also in a time of famine and hardship. There's a beautiful story about how the Salish came to know the bitterroot plant, and you can find that online. There's some people that are way better storytellers than I am that will show you that the bitterroot was presented to us by the creator, and he sent a bird down to show us this plant. And from there, we have coexisted. But a lot of people have seen the bitterroot and know the bitterroot. It's Montana state flower by its beautiful bloom. It's gorgeous. I love the bitterroot when it flowers in the summertime. But the Salish actually know it by its green succulent time, which is about spring, early spring. It's a first food. So it was really critical when we were coming out of the winter months and we're kind of starving to replenish us and bring us back to life. So we take the roots, which is why we can't eat them in the summertime because all of that energy is going to making the flower. When it's green and succulent like that, all of the roots have that storage of nice carbohydrates and sugars and the things that we need. So when we see these succulent leaves coming out in the springtime, we know that it's time to start digging bitterroot. And because the bitterroot was presented to a woman who was she was crying in this time of famine because her family was struggling. Women have largely been the keepers of the knowledge of the bitterroot plant. So we'll send out women to watch over the landscape, and when it's time to dig the bitterroot, they'll let us know, and then we'll bring everyone together for a celebration, and continue that knowledge. However, it is important to note that even though women largely were the keepers of traditional knowledge over time, it was also, it could be men's work. The idea of kind of gendered work roles in society was not something that we did. It was basically just like what you were good at, what you wanted to do, you could go ahead and do that. So if men wanted to gather and forage, they very well could. If women wanted to be warriors, they could also do that as well. So it was a shared society, so the work was shared in that sense as well. But a lot of that knowledge has been passed down from grandmothers and aunties to the younger generation. And the art is by a Salish artist named Aspen Decker, and it's titled "They Are Cleansing the Roots." So once we dig them out of the ground, we peel off the kind of outside layer, and then we lay it out to dry. And once it's dried, it can be reconstituted at any time. So the bitterroot is very important in that sense because once we dug it up, we could keep it for as long as we wanted to. I have some in my house from like a couple years ago, and if I were to throw it in some berry soup, it would be good to go. So that's why, you know, we have these different methods, but they help feed us for long periods of time. And I also just want to say I'm an ethnobotanist. How many of you have heard of ethnobotany? Oh, that's great. Okay. Usually I go to presentations, not a lot of people know what ethnobotany is, so that's really exciting to be in a room that people are aware of that. So the nitty-gritty of, you know, Western science and botany and those types of things, you know, I have a baseline understanding of that, but a lot of my work is really rooted in how my people have interacted with plants over the thousands of years, how we have collected knowledge, how we have you know, created different foraging methods in order to keep the plants going, and what are the songs and the language and the cultural components that go into us knowing those plants. So what I have learned that Salish ethnobotany teaches us, and that I think everyone can benefit from, is that we as human beings are integral to the ecosystem. We're not separate from it. Once we become separate from the ecosystem, then we start to have dominion over it. And that's when we have these issues of, oh, there's many of them. But we have to recognize that we have stake in the land and the health of the land and the health of the plants. And if we don't have that stake, well, then it's easier to destroy those things. But when we love those things and we are those things, then it becomes more important to protect them and keep them going for the next generations. In addition to that, we honor all living things, and that's guided by our creation story. In the Salish creation story, humans were actually last. The world was populated by land and water and minerals and animals and plants long before we showed up, because Creator tasked the plants and the animals to prepare the world for us, because he didn't think that, or she didn't think that the world was quite ready for human beings. So we sent all of the animals out to prepare that for us. And so we recognize that we're really late to the game, and we have to respect all of those beings that came before us. We are a reflection of the health of the natural world. A lot of my research is engaging with local community and talking to them about what does your health mean to you, not necessarily from a Western perspective, although that is important, but what does Indigenous perspective say about your own health and well-being, and what are the components that go into that? And I have found that the health of the natural world, the health of the land, the health of the water, the health of the plants is very integral to how people, Salish people, perceive their own health and well-being. We also learn to balance abundance and scarcity throughout time. I think capitalism and colonization in this kind of Western world that we live in, we feel like we can just take and take and take and use and use and use. But throughout time, the Salish cultivated very particular foraging practices to make sure that year after year, our plants would repropagate, but also that we weren't taking needlessly from the environment. Because we recognize that there are other beings that eat the berries too, or that use this particular area as well. And we wanted to leave that for them. So this kind of ties into reciprocity and careful observation of the land. We have to make sure that we're not taking too much, but we're also making sure that we're giving back. And that kind of ties into, it's really hard to see, but that middle long photo on the very left-hand side, there's this kind of stick and it's got a little T shape like this. We call that a petse, and that's one of our traditional digging tools. And the cool thing about a petse is that it has a curved bottom so that when you stick it in the ground and use it to dig up roots, it doesn't harm the plant, but it also oxidizes the soil. And helps to kind of do that soil turnover so that the plants, the next generation, will have a little bit more nutrients and things like that. And all of those tools in there are traditional tools that we used for berry picking or hide scraping. We have parfleches in there. Those are like containers. And then the digging tools, those were also made by Tim Ryan. He was incredible. And the other things that ethnobotany teaches us is that the land has many teachings and teachers. So I included this photo of a glacier lily, and we found that we could eat glacier lilies by watching grizzly bears. Because grizzly bears are omnivorous as well. We eat meat and plants, and they eat meat and plants. And so we would watch them and see what they would eat to determine what we could eat as well. And so when grizzly bears come out of hibernation, they are known to go to glacier lily patches and dig them up and eat the bulbs. And so we learned that as well. And glacier lilies are one of our food plants that we use. Another thing is that, this knowledge adapts through time. We have kind of the same traditions that carry us forward, this idea of reciprocity and balance and recognizing us as a part of the ecosystem, but we also are modern adapting peoples and we've made it this far. And so what are the different ways that technology can influence how we use traditional food plant knowledge, but also pass that knowledge forward? So for example, the digging stick, again, used to be made of wood or animal bone, but people now have made them out of metal. So we have metal digging sticks, and that's kind of one of our adaptations throughout time, even though the structure of it stays the same. And when we think about traditional ecological knowledge and ethnobotany and those types of things, the stories, the language, and the culture are all part of that body of knowledge. I myself have a little bit of Western science understanding, and I think that has really helped me to know how to identify plants when I'm out in the wild on my own. However, it is all of the components of being Salish and how I've learned to grow up and have relationships with these plants that really guides how I take care of them and treat them. And so both of those things can coexist, but they must be in the same vein. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the First Foods for Health project, which is a community exploration of food plants, Salish Health, and our futures. That was my dissertation, and it was a community collaborative effort to understand what the current relationships are with food plants at the moment in our tribe, and how do we want to see them going into the future. And so briefly, I wanted to connect this kind of to my why of why I'm pursuing this work. And I never thought I would be an ethnobotanist. I was not on my bingo card when I was like 5 years old. I thought I was going to be a vet. So this is a very big plot twist for me. But the reasoning behind why I'm pursuing health and subsistence activities and food systems is that post-colonial disease patterns in Indigenous peoples across the world have had very similar trajectories of infectious disease that mostly wiped us out, followed by malnutrition, followed by obesity, cancer, diabetes, a lot of chronic illnesses that are very present. At the moment, American Indians and Alaska Natives are 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with diabetes compared to the majority. And they also have this high prevalence of chronic illnesses and comorbidities that go with this. This is something I have observed in my own community and communities across Montana. And I wanted to understand, well, why is that? And it's because of this large separation that we had through time between our subsistence activities and that seasonal round that we practiced for thousands of years to a more westernized diet and a more westernized way of living, sitting at a computer, all those types of things. But also those social emotional elements where connecting with family, connecting with self, identity, those are all rooted in how we existed as a society that is segmented now due to settler colonization and historical trauma. And this loss of traditional food systems, you can see, has decreased our dietary diversity, our time on the land, our cultural integrity, all of these different things. And so I wanted to figure out a way that I could make a difference in changing that and seeing firsthand what my community thinks about how we move forward as a people. Continuing on is that Salish and tribal people across the United States are consuming less traditional foods in modern day than in previous generations. So our access to culturally relevant and healthy foods has been limited because of all of the things I have mentioned before. But also we're just not eating as many traditional foods as we used to, and that is due to time constraints and things like that. So I wanted to connect with people on how we can re-strengthen those conditions in our community, and learn the ideas that they have for that. And this quote I really liked from one of the people I interviewed is that historically, traditional food plant knowledge was transmitted organically through family and community. It was almost through osmosis because that's how they live their lives. It was intuitive and reinforced daily. I mean, our people were out on the land constantly learning these things, speaking the language, that type of thing. And now we don't do that as much. This was a community-based learning project. It was founded in Indigenous methodologies and carried out through community-based participatory research. So very much wanted to collaborate with my community and talk about these different topics. So Salish transmission and acquisition of food plant knowledge, traditional food plants and health, what does it mean to be healthy and well from a Salish perspective, and the future of Salish food plants and people. We had very robust and great conversations. These were done in focus groups, and I also had a survey that was transmitted out to my community. And it was a really wonderful time just listening to all the ideas that people had, but also the stories of how they learned about food plants and how they envision food plants being carried out into the future. These are kind of more of the objectives, which is just offering open space for community to talk about it, understanding the strengths and weaknesses, grow a network of community, learn about old and new methods. But really, the most important thing is the takeaways, and it's that we do have a positive foundation to start building change, even though, we have this Western world that we're living in. There are still families that are doing the integral work of passing this knowledge down in their own families through hands-on experience and learning. And I believe that's the best way to do it, but there's also a lot of people that don't have that in their homes or want to learn it. They live somewhere else. I mean, I don't live in my community anymore, so like, how do I increase the access for those people as well? There is opportunity to continue these conversations, which is something I would like to do in the future. And renewing relationship with plants, land, and healthy community. The one thing about food plants and how we transmit knowledge is that it can be very risky. There's a lot of liability, like how much are you supposed to eat of this plant? How do you cook it? How do you prepare it? All of that traditional knowledge that goes with it. The camas plant that I showed you earlier has a toxic sister that looks similar to it. And it has a bulb as well, and they grow in the same area. So how do we help people give them the tools and skills to be able to identify between those two species so that they can pass that knowledge on in their families? Um, these were just some of the products of my dissertation and these conversations that I had with my community. These were developed by a local artist, a Salish artist, Brianna Steele. And it really just shows that we can continue our traditions of food plant knowledge and sharing, but we can do it in modern ways. And we can do it while also cultivating healthy communities. And if you see, like, this is very similar to the seasonal round that I showed earlier, but it's also kind of more of the activities that promote health and well-being in my Salish community, also surrounded by all of the beautiful plant relatives that we know and still sustain us to this day. And then this other image is just kind of this mirror of women in my community digging roots. And then we kind of see that this still happens, but maybe looks a little bit different. And we also know that there are people in our community that would like to have access to this, but how do we build that access and make sure that everyone has the same relationship and opportunity to build? And lastly, I just wanted to showcase some of the really beautiful plants that I've had the privilege of just hanging out with and learning from. There are much more than I can contain in one of these slides, but all of these plants have had a role in shaping the Salish over time, and we hope that they would continue for the next generation and continue to share our gifts with our children and our grandchildren and promote health and well-being in that sense. So I'd like to thank you for participating and listening in. And if you have any questions, I have that. But yeah, lum lumps.